Chapter 9. I landed, stiff enough as you will guess, but pleased to be on shore again. I was a melancholy neighborhood of low islands, overgrown with rank grass and bushes, salt water encircling them, and inside sandy dunes and hummocks, with shallow pools gleaming ghostly in the retreating daylight, while beyond these rose the black bosses of what looked like a forest. Thither I made my way, plunging uncomfortably through the shallows, and tripping over blackened branches which, lying just below the surface, quivered like snakes as the evening breeze ruffled each surface, until the ground hardened underfoot, and presently I was standing, hungry and faint but safe, on dry land again. The forest was so close to the sea one could not advance without entering it, and once within its dark arcades every way looked equally gloomy and hopeless. I struggled through tangles night made more and more impenetrable each minute, until presently I could go no further, and where a dense canopy of trees overhead gave out for a minute on the edge of a swampy hollow, I determined to wait for daylight. Never was there more a wet or weary traveller, or one more desperately lonely than he who wrapped himself up in the miserable insufficiency of his wet rags, and without fire or supper crept amongst the exposed roots of a tree growing out of a bank, and preparing to hope grimly for morning. Round and round, meanwhile, was drawn the close screen of night, till the clearing in front was blotted out, and only the tree-tops, black as rugged hills one behind the other, stood out against the heavy purple of the circlet of sky above. As the evening deepened, the quaintest noises began on every hand, noises so strange and bewildering that as I cowered down with my teeth chattering and stared hard into the impenetrable, they could be likened to nothing but the crying of all the souls of the dead things since the beginning. Never was there such an infernal chaos as that which played up the Martian stars. Down there in front, where hummock grass was growing, some beast squeaking continuously, till I shouted at him. Then he stopped a minute, and began again in an entirely another note. Away on the hills, two rival monsters were calling to each other in tones so hollow they seemed, as I listened, to penetrate through me, and echo out of my heart again. Far overhead, gigantic bats were flitting, the shadows of their wings dimming a dozen universes at once, and crying to each other in shrill tones that rent the air like tearing silk. As I listened to these vampires discussing their infernal loves under the stars, from a branch right overhead broke such a deathly howl from the throat of a wandering forest cat that everything else was hushed for a moment. All about, a myriad of insects were making night giddy with their ghostly fires, while underground and from the labyrinths of matted roots came quaint sounds of rustling snakes and forest pigs and all the lesser things that dig and scratch and growl. Yet I was desperately sleepy. My sword hung heavy as lead at my side, my eyelids drooped, and so far at last I dozed uneasily for an hour or two. Then, all on a sudden, I came wide awake with a shock. The night was quieter now. Away in the forest depths strange noises still arose, but close at hand was a strange hush, like the hush of an expectation, and, listening wonderingly, I was aware of slow, heavy footsteps coming up from the river, now 2 or 3 steps together, then a pause, then another step or two, and as I bent towards the approaching thing, staring into the darkness, my strained senses were conscious of another approach, as like as could be, coming from behind me. On they came, making the very ground quake with their weight, till I judged that both were about on the edge of the clearing, 2 vast rat-like shadows, but as big as elephants, and bringing a most intolerable smell of sour slime with them. There on the edge of the amphitheatre, each for the first time appearing to become aware of the other's presence, the footsteps stopped dead. I could hear the water dripping from the fur of those giant brutes amongst the shadows, and deep breathing of the one nearest me, a scanty 10 paces off, but not another sound in the stillness. Minute after minute passed, yet neither moved. A half hour grew to a full hour, and that hour lengthened amid the keenest tension till my ears ached with listening, and my eyes were sore with straining into the blackness. At last I began to wonder whether those earth-shaking beasts had not been an evil dream, and was just venturing to stretch out a cramped leg and rally myself upon my cowardice, when without warning at my elbow rose the most ear-piercing scream of rage that ever came from a living throat. There was a sweeping rush in the darkness which I could not feel but see, and with a shock the two gladiators met in the midst of the arena. Over and over they went screaming and struggling and slipping and plunging. I could hear them tearing at each other, and the sharp cries of pain. First one and then the other gave as a claw or tooth got home, and all the time, though the ground was quaking under their struggles and the air full of horrible uproar, not a thing was to be seen. I did not even know what manner of beasts they were who rocked and rolled and tore at each other's throats, but I heard their teeth snapping and their fierce breath in the pauses of the struggle, and could but wait in the huddle amongst the roots until it was over. To and fro they went, now at the far side of the dark clearing, now so close that hot drops of blood from their jaws fell on my face like rain in the darkness. It seemed as though the fight would never end, but presently there was more worrying in it, and less of snapping, and it was clear one or the other had enough, and as I marked those black shadows came gasping and struggling towards me. There was a sudden sharp cry, a desperate final tussle, before which strong trees snapped and bushes were flattened out like grass, not 20 yards away, and then for a minute all was silent. One of them had killed, and as I sat rooted to the spot, I was forced to listen while his enemy tore him up and ate him. Many a banquet have I been at, but never an uglier one than that. I sat in the darkness while the unknown thing at my feet ripped the flesh from his half-dead rival in strips, and across the damp night wind came the reek of that abominable feast, the reek of blood and spilt entrails, until I turned away my face in loathing, and was nearly starting to my feet to venture a rush into the forest shadows. But I was spellbound, and remained listening to the heavy munch of blood-stained jaws, until presently I was aware of other lesser feasters who were coming. There was a twinkle of hungry eyes all about the limits of the area, the shine of green points of envious fire that circled round in decreasing orbits, as the little foxes and jackals came crowding in. One fellow took me for a rock, and so I sat, putting his hot, soft paws upon my knee for a space, and others passed me so near I could all but touch them. The big beast had taken himself off by this time, and there must have been several hundreds of these newcomers. A merry time they had of it. The whole place was full of the green, hurrying eyes, and amidst the snap of teeth and yapping and quarreling, I could hear the flesh being torn from the red bones in every direction. One wolf-like individual brought a mass of hot liver to eat between my feet, but I gave him a kick and sent him away much to his surprise. Gradually, however, the sound of this unholy feast died away, and, though you may hardly believe it, I fell off into a doze. It was not a sleep, but it served the purpose, and when in an hour or two a draught of cool air roused me, I awoke, feeling more myself again. Slowly morning came, and the black wall of forest around became full of purple interstices. As the east brightened, those glimmers of light between bough and trunk turned to yellow and red. The day-shine presently stretched like a canopy from point to point of the tree-tops on either side of my sleeping place, and I arose. All my limbs were stiff with cold, my veins emptied by hunger and wounds, and for a space I had not even strength to move. But a little rubbing softened my cramped muscles presently, and limping painfully down to the place of combat, I surveyed the traces of that midnight fight. I will not dwell upon it. It was ugly and grim. The trampled grass, the giant footmarks, each enringing its pool of curdled blood, the broken bushes, the grooved mudslides where the unknown brutes had slid in deadly embrace, the hollows, the splintered boughs, their ragged points tufted with skin and hair, all was sickening to me. Yet so hungry was I that when I turned towards the odious remnants of the vanquished, a shapeless mass of abomination, my thoughts flew at once to breakfasting. I went down and inspected the victim cautiously, a huge rat-like beast as far as might be judged from the bare uprising ribs, all that was left of him, and looking like the framework of a schooner yacht. His heart lay amongst the offal, and my knife came out to cut a meal from it, but I could not do it. 3 times I essayed the task, hunger and disgust contending for mastery. 3 times I turned back in loathing. At last I could stand the sight no more, and, slamming the knife up again, turned on my heels and fairly ran for fresh air and the shore, where the sea was beginning to glimmer in the light a few score yards through the forest stems. There, once more out on the open, on a pebbly beach, I stripped, spread my things out to dry on the stones, and lay myself down with the lapping of the waves in my ears, and the first yellow sunshine thawing my limbs, tried to piece together the hurrying events of the last few days. What were my gay Martians doing? Lazy dogs, to let me, a stranger, be the only one to draw a sword in defense of their own princess. Where was poor Geru, that sweet maiden wife? The thought of her in the hands of the ape-men was odious, and yet was I not mad to try to rescue or even follow her alone? If by any chance I could get off this beast-haunted place and catch up with the ravishers, what had I to look for from them except speedy extinction, and that likely enough by the most painful process they were acquainted with? The other alternative of going back empty-handed was terribly ignominious. I had lectured the amiable young manhood of Seth so soundly on the subject of gallantry, and set them such a good example on 2 occasions, that it would be bathos to saunter back, hands in pockets, and confess I knew nothing of the lady's fate, and had been daunted by the first night alone in the forest. Besides, how dull it would be in that beautiful tumble-down old city without Geru, with no exception day by day of seeing her sylph-like form and hearing the merry tinkle of her fairy laughter as she scoffed at the unknown learning collected by her ancestors in 1,000 laborious years. No, I would go on for certain. I was young, in love, and angry, and before these qualifications difficulties became light. Meanwhile, the first essential was breakfast of some kind. I rose, stretched, and put on my half-dried clothes, and mounting a low hummock on the forest edge, looked round. The sky was riding up finely into the sky. The sun was riding up finely into the sky, and the sea to the eastward shone for leagues and leagues in the loveliest azure. Where it rippled on my own beach and those of the low islands noted overnight, a wonderful fire of blue and red played on the sands as though the broken water were full of living gems. The sky was full of strange gulls with long forked tails, and a lovely little flying lizard with transparent wings of palest green, like those of a grasshopper, was flitting about, picking up insect stragglers. All this was very charming, but what I kept saying to myself was, streaky rashers and hot coffee, rashers and coffee and rolls, and indeed, had the gates of paradise themselves opened at that moment, I fear my first look down the celestial streets within would have been for a restaurant. They did not, and I was just turning away disconsolate when my eye caught, ascending from behind the next bluff down the beach, a thin strand of smoke rising into the morning air.